In the late 1870s, the vast plains of North America witnessed one of the most remarkable journeys in Native American history. The Northern Cheyenne people, who had lived for generations in the rolling hills and river valleys of what we now call Montana, found themselves trapped far from home in the scorching heat of Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma. This is the story of their desperate exodus, a 700-mile journey back to their ancestral lands led by two extraordinary chiefs, Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, and Little Wolf, sometimes called Little Coyote. It was an act of courage, defiance, and an unbreakable desire to return home. Our story begins in the summer of 1876, when the Plains Indians achieved their greatest victory against the United States Army. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a coalition of Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho warriors overwhelmed Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and 5 divisions of the 7th Cavalry. The native forces, united under the leadership of Sitting Bull and joined by fierce warriors like Crazy Horse, dealt a stunning blow to American westward expansion. The victory was celebrated throughout the plains, but it would soon bring terrible consequences for those who had fought for their freedom. Inspired by this victory, Morning Star and Little Wolf rallied their Northern Cheyenne warriors to continue the fight. They believed that one more decisive victory might finally convince the United States to leave their lands in peace. But on a cold November morning in 1876, everything changed. At the battle on the Red Fork, also called the Dull Knife Fight, United States cavalry troops attacked their winter camp in a surprise dawn assault. The Cheyenne warriors fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Their lodges were burned, their supplies destroyed, and in the bitter cold of late November they had no choice but to surrender. In the spring of 1877, the Northern Cheyennes surrendered at Fort Robinson in what is now Nebraska. The chiefs believed, based on the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, that they would be allowed to live peacefully with the Sioux people in their traditional homelands. General George Crook and Colonel Ranald Mackenzie assured them they could stay in the North. But orders came from Washington that told a different story. The Northern Cheyenne were to be sent south to Indian Territory to live with their Southern Cheyenne cousins on a reservation they had never seen. Chief Standing Elk accepted these terms, and in the summer heat, 972 Northern Cheyenne began the long march south. The journey south was a nightmare. Along the dusty trails under the merciless summer sun, exhaustion and disease took their toll. By the time the Northern Cheyenne reached the Southern Cheyenne Reservation in early August 1877, only 937 remained. Some had slipped away during the journey, unable to bear the thought of leaving their homeland. Others had simply collapsed from heat, hunger, and despair. Those who arrived found a land that felt like a prison, nothing like the cool rivers and pine-covered hills of Montana they called home. When the Southern Cheyenne invited their northern relatives to a welcoming feast, Little Wolf and Morning Star discovered the horrible truth about their new home. The feast was nothing more than a pot of thin, watery soup, barely enough to feed a few people, let alone hundreds. The Southern Cheyenne explained with shame that this was all they had. The land provided no wild game to hunt. The water in the streams was muddy and made people sick. The Indian agent, a man named John Miles, promised that food would come if they took up farming, but the supplies never arrived. As summer turned to fall, an outbreak of malaria swept through both bands, and the post surgeon ran out of medicine and simply abandoned his office, leaving the sick to suffer. By late summer 1878, Little Wolf had endured enough. He went to Agent Miles and declared that he was taking his people back north, just as General Crook and Colonel Mackenzie had promised they could do if they gave the reservation a fair chance. Miles told him that was impossible without permission from Washington. Little Wolf tried again and again to negotiate a peaceful departure, but each time Miles gave the same answer. Finally, Morning Star and Little Wolf made their decision. They would leave with or without permission. Little Wolf returned to Miles one final time and spoke words heavy with sorrow and warning. He did not want bloodshed near the agency, but if soldiers came after them, they would fight, and they would make the ground bloody. On the night of September 9, 1878, while the soldiers assigned to watch them slept soundly, the Northern Cheyenne vanished like ghosts. For weeks, warriors had been secretly stealing horses and hiding them beyond the reservation boundaries. Now, in the darkness before dawn, 350 men, women, and children slipped away from their barracks, found their hidden horses, and began riding north. They were going home. By the time the alarm was raised at 3 in the morning on September 10th, the Northern Cheyenne had already put miles between themselves and the reservation, their horses' hooves carrying them toward the land of their ancestors with every passing moment. Captain Joseph Rendelbrock led the pursuit, determined to bring the Cheyenne back by force. But Little Wolf and Morning Star had learned their lessons well from years of warfare. They remembered how Crazy Horse had defeated Captain William Fetterman 12 years earlier by drawing soldiers into an ambush. At a place called Turkey Springs, they prepared their trap. While Morning Star negotiated with 2 Arapaho scouts sent by Rendelbrock, Cheyenne warriors silently surrounded the entire cavalry unit in the narrow canyon. When the parley ended and Rendelbrock ordered his men to fire, the Cheyenne responded with devastating accuracy. For 2 days, on September 13th and 14th, the battle raged. The Cheyenne, though low on ammunition, pinned down the soldiers and forced them to retreat, leaving 3 dead and scrambling for their lives. The Cheyenne pushed north into Kansas, but they needed supplies desperately. Little Wolf sent out small raiding parties with strict orders to avoid killing settlers if possible. They needed food, weapons, ammunition, and horses, not a war with every Kansas farmer. The raiders returned with provisions, though some violence occurred despite the chief's commands. Local newspapers printed sensational stories about the Cheyenne raiders, calling them dangerous renegades. Soon, volunteers from nearby towns joined the cavalry in hunting the Cheyenne. Lieutenant Colonel William Lewis led this mixed force along with Arapaho scouts straight into another Cheyenne ambush at Punished Woman's Fork. Though a young warrior fired too early and spoiled the surprise, the Cheyenne still fought fiercely, mortally wounding Lewis. But this time the cavalry discovered the Cheyenne's horses and killed them, forcing most of the people to continue north on foot. By October, exhausted and pursued relentlessly, Morning Star and Little Wolf faced a difficult choice. Morning Star was tired of running and wanted to head directly to the Red Cloud Agency where Chief Red Cloud might offer them protection. Little Wolf preferred to hide in the Nebraska hills through the winter and resume their journey in spring when conditions improved. Neither chief wanted to separate, but they finally agreed it was their best chance for survival. The 2 bands parted ways, embracing one final time before heading in different directions. Morning Star led his people east toward what he believed was the Red Cloud Agency, unaware that it had been moved and Fort Robinson now stood in its place. On October 23rd, cavalry from Fort Robinson found Morning Star's band. The Cheyenne, numbering about 150 people, were too exhausted to run or fight anymore. Before surrendering, however, the warriors made a brilliant decision. They carefully dismantled their rifles, hiding the parts in their blankets, wrapping them in their clothing, attaching pieces to their moccasins as decorations, and wearing gun parts as amulets around their necks. To the soldiers, they appeared to be harmless and unarmed. Morning Star and his people followed the cavalry to Fort Robinson, hoping they would finally find safety. Instead, they found themselves prisoners, crowded into military barracks never meant to house so many people. Fort Robinson's commander, Captain Henry Wessells, did not want the Cheyenne there, especially with winter approaching. He treated them well at first, providing adequate food and blankets while he waited for orders from Washington. Red Cloud himself came to help negotiate, but his presence made no difference. By early January 1879, Wessells received his orders: the Northern Cheyenne must return to Indian Territory. When Morning Star refused, declaring he would rather die than go south again, Wessells made a terrible decision. He locked the Cheyenne inside the barracks, boarded up the windows, and cut off all food, water, and firewood. For days, the Cheyenne endured freezing temperatures without heat, growing weaker from hunger and thirst. Wessels believed he could starve them into submission. On the night of January 9th, the Cheyenne made their choice. They would rather die fighting for freedom than starve like prisoners. The warriors reassembled their hidden rifles, loading them with what little ammunition they had saved. At a signal, they smashed through the barracks' windows and burst out into the frozen night. Some fled east toward where they hoped to find Red Cloud. Others scattered in different directions, trying to escape in the darkness. But Captain Wessels had soldiers everywhere. Gunfire erupted across the fort grounds. Many Cheyenne were captured immediately. Others were hunted down over the following days. On Antelope Creek, Wessels found a group of between 32 and 37 men, women, and children hiding in a small depression. He ordered his soldiers to open fire and keep firing until everyone was dead. 12 somehow survived the massacre. The dead were buried together in a mass grave that became known simply as the Pit. Morning Star and a small group managed to escape the fort and, after days of traveling through frozen wilderness, finally reached the real Red Cloud Agency in Dakota Territory. Chief Red Cloud, true to his reputation as a defender of his people, took them in and hid them from the authorities who came searching. Meanwhile, Little Wolf's band had survived the winter hidden in the sand hills of Nebraska, just as he had planned. When spring came and they began moving north again, they were found by Lieutenant William Clark, an officer who, unlike many of his peers, showed genuine sympathy for the Cheyenne's plight. Clark convinced Little Wolf that surrender was their only option, but promised to help them find a better solution than returning south. News of the Fort Robinson massacre spread across the nation through newspaper reports, and for once, public opinion turned in favor of the Native Americans. People were horrified by the story of starving people, including children, being shot down as they tried to escape. Morning Star used this shift in public sentiment to negotiate tirelessly for what the Northern Cheyenne had wanted all along, a reservation in their homeland. He stood firm in his resolve, refusing every demand to return south. His courage and determination, along with the public outcry, finally convinced the government to establish what would become the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation in Montana Territory. The Tongue River Agency was created, giving the Northern Cheyenne a permanent home in the land of their ancestors. Morning Star never lived to see the Northern Cheyenne Reservation officially recognized in 1884. He died peacefully of natural causes in 1883, but he died knowing his people would have a home in Montana. Little Wolf lived longer, spending years as a scout for the United States Army, though he struggled with sadness and alcohol until his own death from natural causes in 1904. Today, both chiefs rest together in the Lame Deer Cemetery on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, honored as the leaders who brought their people home against impossible odds. Their descendants still live on that reservation, maintaining their traditions, language, and culture despite everything their ancestors endured. The Northern Cheyenne Exodus remains one of the most powerful stories in Native American history. It reveals the deepest truth about human nature, the unstoppable desire to return home. The United States government had promised the Northern Cheyenne they could live in their homeland, then broke that promise. They had promised the Cheyenne could return north if they disliked Indian Territory, then broke that promise too. 700 miles the Northern Cheyenne traveled, fighting battles, enduring starvation, surviving a massacre, but never giving up on their dream of home. Their story mirrors those of countless other Native peoples whose lands were taken in the name of progress and manifest destiny. Yet the genocidal policies ultimately failed because the Northern Cheyenne survived and their culture thrives today. A testament to the unbreakable spirit of people who refuse to let their homeland slip away. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next journey through time. Share this story with anyone who loves learning about courage, determination, and the human spirit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.